All right, so what I have today are a few thoughts about some directions to go on the affirmative for the Stoa team policy topic. Resolve: the United States federal government should substantially reform its marine natural resource policies. And what I've always believed in at the beginning of the season is that you go for an anchor affirmative on which you get really deep and you become an expert, and you try a few tournaments in to be so comfortable with it that you can answer most of your opponent's arguments off the top of your head. But I've also believed in going into the season with a few satellite affirmatives, a few specialized affirmatives that you researched yourself and you know quite well, and in a situation where you know the other team is very deep on your affirmative and has a very good record for it, you can change direction. And if you want to follow that model and have the anchor affirmative and one or two satellite affirmatives, then you've really got to dig in and get a lot of your scut work done over the summer. Now, the ideal, of course, when you're looking for an affirmative is to find something where all the research goes one way. And the negative, good luck to them. They can go off to the library if they want, but what they're going to find, for the most part, is pretty feeble. You almost never can tell ahead of time that you've stumbled onto one of those treasures until the season gets going. And I have to say, I don't think that any of the suggestions I have today necessarily amount to that. But, that is the objective. So as you're reading about these different proposals, or whatever proposals you've come up with, what I hope you're keeping in mind is it is extraordinarily important that you not just look at it as an affirmative, not just look for solvency evidence, not just look for the puzzle pieces that would help you to put it together as an affirmative, but that you be sizing up and assessing what negative evidence am I seeing and what picture am I getting of what negative evidence is available. One last thing before I get into the suggestions I have, which is that it is always the case that the smart thing to do at the very beginning of the season when you're a team policy debater and you live and die by your research is to go and do a sweep of the library. And there are a couple of suggestions I have in here that come out of past experience with recent, and in some cases not that recent, debate topics. But debaters will sometimes do that out of a feeling of safe refuge, a wish for safe refuge, a wish for the reassurance from experience. They'll just retread arguments that have been successful before instead of going out and seeing what's current. And so most of the suggestions I have today is from a pretty quick and dirty survey that we did of what's out there in this subject matter and some things that kind of jumped out at us as possible affirmatives. But it's really, really a good investment of time for you to do that yourself. Find the best, good, solid university library, serious research library that you can nearby, and go through all of the recent volumes of journals, and go through the think tanks that you can find online or otherwise, and look at their recent publications, and see for yourself what's out there, and from that, put together, start to make your short list of what you want your affirmative to be, and what your priorities are going to be for what affirmatives you're going to get ready to debate for the fall. With all that as preface, I have divided up the direction that I think the topic may go to 4 different categories. Category number 1 is stop a pollutant. Category number 2 is about energy production. Category number 3 is about international activity. And category number 4 is sort of my catch-all category for everything else. And I'm not talking about negative approaches today. I'm going to come back and do that on another day. But category number 1, stop a pollutant. This is probably one of the first things that a lot of people will think of when they read this topic wording. Take something that's polluting the ocean, something that is making our marine natural resources unusable, and put a stop to it. And so, in a lot of cases, these affirmatives are going to have huge, huge solvency gaps because many of these, the pollution is coming from all over the world. So for the United States to take action on its own, unless you can find solvency evidence that says that the United States as a leader can bring about an international agreement, like, say, the Montreal Protocol when it came to ozone depletion. If you can find that evidence, then you may be able to claim that you solved the pollution problem entirely. But otherwise, you may be stuck with one of those where you say, well, the United States is the biggest source of the pollution, so if we get ours under control, we abate the problem a lot. Here are the ones that I've seen that I think are reaching ripeness to where you're going to be able to find some good recent evidence, and they might make attractive affirmatives for that reason. There's a surprising amount written about flame retardant. A lot of products made in the United States, children pajamas for some reason pop into my head, and I think children's stuffed animals too, but there are a lot of other things where safety regulations require that they be embedded with flame retardant. And the problem is that flame retardant chemicals are showing up in the ocean. They're coming out of landfills, they're coming out of all sorts of non-point sources, And when they get into the ocean, they have really, really dire effects for marine ecosystems. So if you just do a search for flame retardants in the ocean, you'll find a lot of articles that come up and have some proposals for what to do to try to put a stop to all the leaching of flame retardants into the ocean. Similarly, there are similar things being written about plastics. Now, that's nothing new. That goes back 25, 30 years to the last time I debated a fossil fuels topic when I was in college, and the fact that plastics were getting out of landfills and plastics were showing up in the ocean, and there were big islands in the middle of the ocean of garbage, much of which was plastic, because a lot of the other kind of landfill material gets weathered down and it sort of biodegrades, but plastics, they don't, and they can float in the ocean just for year after year after year. But if you do some searches about plastics pollution and some leaching too, some of the chemicals, the petrochemicals that go into the making of plastics, that's a direction you might go as far as a pollution source that's making it into the ocean. A third one that comes up every few years is ballast water. Ships, when they are at sea, they will take on water to make the ship heavy enough for conditions, and then a lot of times when they get into port, they dump out their ballast water. And the problem is, if they took on ballast water in a different part of the world, a lot of times it contains exotic species that are going to contaminate the harbor that it has reached. And this is something that there have been some attempts to address it over the years, so if you go and you research it, you might find that there are new safeguards and new preventative measures, and it's really not particularly significant or inherent anymore, but it's worth a look. And it's definitely worth including on your list of affirmatives that you need to have accounted for. You know, if that evidence is out there that it's not much of a problem anymore, then get that evidence and have it in a file in case someone turns up wanting to make use of an old reliable debate argument that's been around a bunch of times. A fourth one that I've seen a couple of articles, some recent press for is urban runoff. And there have, over the last couple of years, been a few vacation beaches that have had to close because really incredibly nasty stuff, like high in fecal matter, was getting out to vacation beaches. Now, it's not the case that that is necessarily that strategic of an affirmative if you're debating a very technically proficient team and you have an alum judge, but it's possible that's one of the satellite affirmatives where the yuck factor and the kind of squirm factor would make it a really good affirmative for a parent judge, where you can put some of your rhetorical fireworks on display. So that's something to give a little thought to. And then there's noise pollution. And this is something that I know has been a controversy for the past 5-10 years, and there have been some steps to try to modify it, but the use of sonar, when submarines and other ocean-going vehicles use sonar as a locating or navigational device, there's ample evidence out there that that interferes with the navigating capabilities of a lot of marine species, and in particular large cetaceans like whales. So if you go and look for, if your search terms are sonar and cetacean, C-E-T-A-C-E-A-N, then you're likely to find whatever the latest is on that particular controversy. Now, the thing with that affirmative is that you probably would have to be ready for a military readiness debate, because if you put limits on the use of sonar, then it's possible that that would affect our power projection. We wouldn't be able to get our Navy, and in particular our submarines, to trouble spots in the world very quickly if those regulations limited their ability to use their navigational instruments. So that's something that all along the way while you were prepping that affirmative, you would have to be getting ready for that debate if you wanted that affirmative to fly. But it's something to check out. You might check into low pH runoff pollution that is acidic. Because ocean acidification, I mean, you can stack up enough to fill your entire house with articles about how severe ocean acidification is and what dire consequences it portends for a lot of marine ecosystems. The problem is that for the most part, the biggest contributing factor to ocean acidification is atmospheric carbon dioxide, which means if you really want a plan that's going to take a big chunk out of the problem, you have to welcome the global warming debate, which I don't know how controversial that would become with your particular judging pool. But there are a couple of proposals. There's one particular very spiffy law review I saw that talked about if you could just get non-point sources, runoff sources that were low in pH, if you could get those under control with a few common sense measures, you could, like I was saying at the beginning of this video, at least abate the problem somewhat to where the acidification could happen slowly and a lot of different species, a lot of ecosystems would have more time to adapt. Okay, the second category is energy production, and I think there are a couple of forms that these are going to take. One form that they'll take is energy dependence is bad for the economy, energy dependence complicates international relations, and so the solution is either to deregulate offshore drilling for oil, offshore petroleum and fossil fuel production, or to use alternative sources of energy that make use of the ocean. So ocean thermal energy conversion, or tide power, or offshore wind power, or you may find some others. And some people will take that direction and they'll say that what you can do with the sources of energy you can get from the ocean is you can make the United States much less dependent on overseas energy sources, and here are all the advantages to that. Another approach is to say that with all of these energy sources, accidents are inevitable. And what we need is we need a better way to assign liability. We need a better way to respond when the accident happens. If you do you do a little reading into BP's spill in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago, then you're going to find that the response was really not very effective, and sorting out which of the several different firms came together on that project, which of them are liable, and creating the proper incentives to make sure it doesn't happen again, that there are lots of proposals being written for how liability law needs to be straightened out. And that's a direction you may see people take. And all they may claim is just that accidents are going to, the harm area pretty much would be the same as the first category, that it would be stopping a source of pollution. Only instead of identifying the pollution by type, it would be identifying it by polluter. Okay, the third category I have is international activity. So our first skim of the topic, our mistaken impression was that what the United States had to do was to protect its own marine natural resources, so its own EEZ and so forth. But that's not true. The wording is that the United States just has to reform its marine natural resource policies. So the policies have to be the policies of the United States, but the marine natural resources can be anywhere in the world. And so there are a lot of different affirmative possibilities that opens up. One of them that you could do that would be a nice little quick and dirty affirmative, and year after year after year, the impact cards on this saying that it is a dry tinderbox waiting for a spark to set it on fire never seem to fade out, and that would be to optimize the U.S. position on the Spratly Island dispute in the South China Sea and claim South China Sea warfare as the advantage. The dispute is entirely about marine natural resources. So if you do a little reading into what the current state of that dispute is, and you can find anybody who's got good explanations for why their proposal of a changed U.S. posture toward this dispute would improve it, would make it more likely for the sides to be able to settle the dispute, near as I can tell, that is a completely topical affirmative. And that's an affirmative where the harm evidence goes very much your way, because the takeouts that people will try to cut, saying it's not that big of a risk, not that big of a danger, you will dwarf them with the quality of the evidence going your way. And then whoever it is, whoever's proposal you find for an improved position on the dispute, if it's the kind of thing that people have not written specific answers to, you just have a pretty downhill fight defending that affirmative, I think. So that is worth looking into. I don't think I would run it all year long, but it's an affirmative that I think you could pop out as one of your satellite affirmatives. And it's one that I don't think would take an enormous amount of research on side issues to get on top of, because really it's a couple of very straightforward claims. So that's one that you might want to add to your list. A second one is to sign the United States become a signatory to the law of the sea. And I have to admit, the period of debate I'm about to talk about was mostly after I got out of being a full-time debate coach, but there were a number of years when, for the United States to sign the law of the sea was everybody's favorite affirmative, whether it was topical or whether it was not topical. Year after year after year, you had people running, the U.S. should sign the law of the sea treaty. So if I were you, I would just get into that literature, see what the state of it is, see if it still runs as heavily in the direction of people being in favor of it as it used to be. And you can claim overfishing, you can claim a lot of different marine natural resource type, scarcity type advantages, resource war type advantages. That's something that you're going to have to account for. You're going to have to know what to do about the law of the sea, because even if you're not running that as an affirmative, believe me, there will be other teams that will be running it as an affirmative, which means you need a strategy. All right. A third international activity affirmative would be shark finning. And I put this in the category of international activity affirmatives because Either the United States would have to change its interpretation of its multilateral trade obligations, or it would have to try to spearhead the creation of a new international agreement. And there's actually pretty good solvency evidence for each. The harm evidence is really quite good. Talking about how sharks are an important keystone species, and also just talking about the cruelty of what fishers do when they catch sharks and they just lop their fins off because shark fin soup is a delicacy in so much of the world, and then they just throw the shark back in the water with no fins. And that's the kind of thing where not only is the evidence very much stacked up in your direction, but it's another one that's similar to the urban runoff affirmative I was talking about before, where you can give a heartfelt plea in the last rebuttal and quite possibly get through to a parent judge who may have lost some of the finer points of the technical clash and all the line-by-line debating, and you could just get to them with, look, this is gruesome and this is suffering that we could do something about and we could really address. So if I were you, I would account for at least shark finning. Possibly include it as a satellite affirmative, although I think probably the solvency debate is complicated enough that it's not really that attractive as a satellite affirmative, because I think in the end, when you have your slugfest with the negative on the different solvency arguments and the circumvention arguments and the black market arguments, I think in the end you can come out on top of that debate. I think this may be a good affirmative maybe for your novice team to run, just because it's real simple. There's not a lot of wrinkles to it where you have to understand some of the finer points of debate. I don't expect for there to be a lot of complicated counterplans. I don't expect for there to be a lot of highly technical language. So it's really probably not a good anchor affirmative. Could be a decent satellite affirmative, but possibly even better as a novice affirmative. Got some appeal that way. Another affirmative is for the United States to sign the Convention on Biological Diversity, and this turns up as a proposal for addressing a number of different sort of marine biodiversity issues, and it probably has a little bit of a topicality problem, specifically a problem with overbreadth topicality, that what the plan actually does, it's not extra topical, it's just the single action spans out beyond topical action. But if you have a judging pool that's pretty patient with affirmatives that are not grossly not topical, not so non-topical that they shock the conscience, then Convention on Biodiversity might be something for you to look into. You can claim big species extinction, and you do have to debate on solvency, the whole international cooperation, and do international regimes work. But if that's a debate that you're up for, it might be a debate that you've had on previous topics and you felt pretty comfortable giving those explanations in the last rebuttals, then that might be a good affirmative for you. The last one I have in the category of international activity is to change U.S. policy or negotiate with Russia and other nations about the Arctic. Just from a year or two ago, there was a good deal written about how the Arctic might become a flashpoint for superpower confrontation. I haven't really found a very debate-ready proposal that could address it, that could become your advocacy. But if you were to go in, at least to get the negative evidence in case someone else has found it, you might stumble across a good, elegant proposal that would make a topical plan and that would be pretty straightforward. It might make a satellite affirmative, if nothing else. Okay, the last of the four categories, we've talked about stopping a pollutant, about energy production, about international activity. I have kind of a catch-all category, and here what I've included are affirmatives that are somewhat systemic in nature and a couple that are just kind of outliers. So the first affirmative that I stumbled across, and this one really kind of appeals to me, that is systemic in nature, is the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine. And so what you do is you do a search for a woman who's got a very cool name. Her first name is Mary, like the mother of Jesus, and her last name is Turnipseed. Turnipseed. And you can find a law review article that she co-authored with 3 other authors, and then from 2 or 3 years later you can find her doctoral dissertation. And she's actually given a couple of professional talks where she's addressed Obama's national ocean policy, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and she said, if the national ocean policy is missing out on the public trust doctrine, then it is really losing about half its effectiveness. The public trust doctrine, you'll have to go and read the details of it, otherwise this video is going to go 45 minutes if I try to go into the finer points of that. But one of the things it would do is it would cut across a lot of departmental lines and a lot of disciplinary lines, and I know that the National Ocean Plan is already supposed to do that, but she's got some fairly good explanations why if this is adopted as a common law doctrine, and if it is an enforcement tool in the hands of all the agencies that are trying to coalesce around the national ocean policy, then they've got a much stronger and a much more coherent approach to enforcing a lot of these regulations that are trying to keep the oceans clean so that they're not piecemeal, so that they're not duplicating one another's efforts. It's one of those affirmatives where it's systemic in nature. It claims that there is a systemic flaw, and if you just address the systemic flaw with a framework, and if you read up on what the framework consists of and get to where you can do your about 15-second explanation in cross-examination, these affirmatives, especially when you start running them early in the year and you become the expert, can be unbelievably hard to beat. And I have known teams over the years that were about in the middle of the pack as far as technical proficiency, but they stumble on one of these affirmatives, and round after round after round they hear everything the negative comes up with, and they get better and better at the arguments they're hearing all the time. And because of the nature of this very powerful explanation, there's a flaw at the heart of the process, and we have got a revolutionary way to address that flaw. Those wind up being really good affirmatives. They're distinct, I think, from affirmatives like, here's a pollutant, we stop the pollutant. Because these types of affirmatives, they don't identify a harm area and then address the harm area. They're sometimes a little bit harder for judges to understand at the beginning of the debate, but they say there is a bureaucratic problem, or there is a problem in our perceptions that cuts across all the harm areas on the topic. And so, what the plan does, the plan is engineered to address that bureaucratic area, that bureaucratic problem, that problem of perception. And it does so in a very comprehensive fashion. So if I were you, I would look up Mary Turnipseed and public trust doctrine. Second thing, I've mentioned already the national ocean policy. And let's see, there's an article that ran about last October talking about partisan opposition to the national ocean policy. There's actually not a ton being written about this. There are enough other issues, I guess, to keep us busy. But you can find some of the administration's opponents who raise objections to the national ocean policy. They say there's not statutory authorization for it to happen just as an executive order. They say that it is a regulatory overreach. And what you could do is you could write a fix to the national ocean policy based on those objections. And this is one that I think is a satellite affirmative only for a very limited set of judges. But the ones that you have where you can sort of run the ocean version of repeal Obamacare, and you can say the national ocean policy had good intentions, but it had built into it some of the shortcomings of the Obama administration, and so our plan is to fix those. And you can just go to some of these recognizable names, some of the Republican Party leaders, and ways that they say that this needs to be fixed to be viable. And, very clearly I think it would be topical, because the national ocean policy is our comprehensive effort at protecting our marine natural resources at this point, and you would be giving it a good overhaul, so that would be a very topical action. And even if it couldn't necessarily outweigh disadvantages, even if there are solvency arguments out there that you're not sure how you would answer, for a specific kind of judge, this would have so much appeal that it's the kind of thing that you might have ready for a particular debate with a particular judge where you know that running your usual affirmative is not as strategic as it would ordinarily be. Two more. There's an article by a law student or professor by the name of Elena Bryant in the Asian Pacific Law and Policy Journal in 2011 about Hawaiian environmental impact statements. And I was reading this over, and this really looked intriguing. It would be kind of a small, fly-under-the-radar affirmative. It wouldn't claim that much except preservation of indigenous culture. Now, you might think there might be a topicality problem because it's small. It might not be a substantial reform. But I think you could make some arguments like Hawaii is the only one of the 50 states completely surrounded by the ocean, so it's a special case, and it's even a test case. And it's one of those where she makes all the arguments necessary, including identifying the harm and doing it in pretty compelling terms, and going through all the details of the solution, and not that many people have written on the subject. So it's one of those, we used to stumble across them, and we would think of them as satellite affirmative in one article. And you might go out and you might find more written about indigenous culture in Hawaii and the hits it's taken and the efforts to bring it back. And so you aren't just reading an entire 1AC that comes from one author, because that can create some problems for appearance's sake. But with the entire thing having been put together by a single author's mind, I find sometimes that there's an elegance to those kinds of proposals that makes them attractive, not as the anchor affirmative to be run all year, but as a satellite affirmative that's a utility affirmative for specific situations. The last one is I was surprised for about 6 or 7 years ago when the high school kids had their national service topic. One of the topical ways that they could do national service was the armed forces, and a lot of people had affirmatives that beefed up the Coast Guard. And what they did is they increased the staffing of the Coast Guard. Now, right away, there's a spending problem, there's a, who's going to pay for this problem, but they were able to claim some really, really big advantages. They were able to claim things like the Coast Guard is tasked with enforcing overfishing regulations, and overfishing, you're going to find, I mentioned it briefly talking about the law of the sea, but the impact evidence to overfishing, global famine, marine biodiversity, loss of biodiversity and mass species extinction, collapse of ecosystems planet-wide, that's a very big advantage you could claim. There was also good evidence talking again about U.S. power projection, about how in a lot of cases the Coast Guard is the unit of the armed forces that is quickest, best able to respond to a crisis. And as a matter of fact, there was one team that was claiming that we would depend on the Coast Guard to keep open the Straits of Hormuz. And if the Straits of Hormuz were ever closed, there could be an oil shock, and an oil shock could topple the world economy. And the evidence on this was reasonably good. There was another that was claiming that the Coast Guard actually has to enforce regulations on fishing for horseshoe crabs. And horseshoe crabs apparently are unbelievably important for various vaccines, and in particular smallpox vaccine. And, smallpox is down to just about nothing, but there's very, very good impact evidence that if we don't have horseshoe crabs and the ability to use whatever it is they contribute to the making of vaccines, then we could have a pandemic outbreak of disease that could wipe out all life on the planet. And then there was evidence about terrorism, that the next terrorist attack, the soft target that they are aiming their efforts at, will be our seaports. And therefore, when the Coast Guard is under-resourced, then that becomes an even bigger vulnerability, an even more tempting target, and another big, epic, successful terrorist attack. There are a lot of consequences that would flow from that. Even more draconian restrictions on our freedoms, possible military lash-out. All of those are possible outcomes of the Coast Guard not being able to keep a lid on, not being able to keep our vulnerability to a minimum when it comes to our seaports. And so what I think you could do, there's a little bit of a topicality issue if all you do is take resources and shove them in the direction of the Coast Guard, because that's not really a change in policy. But maybe what you could do is that a lot of this evidence was talking about they had to downplay those priorities, those mission priorities, because they didn't have the resources to pursue them. Maybe by statute or maybe by regulation, maybe through the Joint Chiefs of Staff directive, you make those the top priorities, and then you provide the resources for them, just like you're allowed to provide the resources for any topical course of action. And then, maybe you do have to debate people on spending and how much it would cost, but if these impacts that you're claiming are big enough, then I think probably you could just outweigh it. That's probably an affirmative that is going to make more sense to an alum judge, maybe, than to a parent judge or a community judge who thinks, well, okay, that's a good idea, but we can't afford it. But it's something to investigate. And I've thought for a long time that there are certain circumstances, if you are a very technically proficient and very experienced debate team, that running what I would think of as a big stick affirmative, where you claim a lot of large impacts and a fair amount of complexity, you can take on teams that are not quite as experienced and you can overwhelm them. And this, I think, may be more resources for the Coast Guard and several different missions that they're currently underfunding. That could be this year's version of a big stick affirmative. Okay. So with all of that, out of all of that, if I had recommendations, I think that there are three that I really think you ought to look into. The first one, I think I've telegraphed this, is public trust doctrine. I think that one has a good deal of potential. The second one, just from having seen how many people are writing fairly well-elaborated articles detailing both the harm and their proposal, I think shark finning really has a lot of potential. And then third, you ought to investigate ballast water, because if ballast water is still viable as an affirmative, it's an affirmative that has a good enough track record, enough different people have been successful with, that even though I started out at the beginning saying don't try to retread past successes, sometimes it is a good idea to retread past successes just because a controversy has something about it that makes it fit in well as a good debate argument. And one last thing, I am not recommending that you go and look at Urban Dictionary because a lot of things on Urban Dictionary are kind of raunchy. But in our digging around trying to find good definitions of marine natural resources, we had Urban Dictionary come up, and there's actually this little exchange that apparently happened at the start of 2004 where someone put a definition on Urban Dictionary of marine natural resource and said, it's not ballast water. Ballast water isn't topical. And someone came along about a month later and said, it's nothing you'd find on Urban Dictionary. Urban Dictionary is not credible. You can't use it for a topicality argument. So apparently the high school kids were slugging it out trying to beat ballast water on topicality by posting their own definition on Urban Dictionary. And I suppose I should be horrified because that's deeply unethical use of evidence. But when you look at it and you see, okay, here's the desperate negative team that can't figure out how to beat the case, and here's the indignant affirmative who's putting their response up on the same website, I have to admit I thought it was kind of funny. So, those are my first impressions of the topic. It doesn't mean I won't be back later in the summer with more affirmative ideas, especially as crackpot ideas occur to me, but that ought to be enough to get you started. And if you've had enough of a break from last year's topic and you're ready to start getting your ducks in a row for the 2013-2014 season, then best of luck to you.